Today's focus is on how to prepare for interviews. And I think I went a bit overboard on the 10 steps approach this week. Lots of things were done in 10, but there we go, it's too late now. So we're going to stick with that format, run through 10 best practices that you can utilize as you are preparing for your interviews. Now, the reality is that every different career field or industry has its own particular type of interviewing approach that they take. But there are some commonalities. And what we'll focus on today are certainly those things that can be applicable no matter what the field is, no matter what the role is, to a certain extent, that you can be preparing for, that will position you for success in an interviewing scenario. So yes, you will find that there are nuances for different roles and different organizations, but we'll sort of touch on that as we go through that and make sure that you have some key best practices related to that. As you may have gathered already from this week, I am Dr. Joseph Barber. I am the Director of Graduate Career Initiatives here at Penn Career Services, actually here at Penn Career Services today. So welcome. So we're going to jump straight into number one, and then we're going to run through all of the different numbers that we have here. Without further ado, let's start off with preparing for interviews by doing research, right? By doing not your actual research, but research into the organizations that are out there. So if we think about the interviewing timeline, there are sort of multiple points that you have to sort of think about and prepare for as part of this. In many cases, you might have a couple of weeks notice for an interview, which is an ideal scenario to do some of the things that I'm talking about. In other cases, you might find that there is a very short turnaround, and they get, someone reaches out to you by phone and says, "Are you ready for an interview? We have availability next, on Thursday," and it's only Monday. So I appreciate that sometimes the timelines are very short. Some of the long-term research that you can do is actually helpful to do even if you are applying but haven't got the interview yet. So you can sort of preempt some of the research so that it's not such a time crunch when it actually comes to preparing for interviews. So these are some of the things that we can think about as we are preparing for research. And one of the areas that I would say that you can research a lot, and many people I think don't spend enough time here, is really the social media related to the organizations that you're interested in. So you've looked at the job description, you've really thought about it, you've put your application materials together, that's great. Hopefully you have an interview because they've reached out to you. Now's the time to sort of take your research into a sort of a deeper layer, a sort of a deep level layer of understanding the organization, understanding the department, understanding the people. And one of the easiest ways to gain insights into these things, other than networking, which obviously we'll touch on again in a little bit, is this social media. Because especially if it's a large organization, they will have multiple channels across all of their platforms, Instagrams, Twitters, and LinkedIn's, and Facebooks, and everything in between. And it's worth spending some time there, because what you can do as part of this research is really get a sense of the people, get a sense of their work, their skills, their experiences. Now, it's a little bit, they certainly haven't presented every bit of information. They want to present the best information, right? So you have to sort of understand that aspect of it. But if you look at some of these resources, what you'll begin to find are sort of commonalities in the sort of the language that they're using to describe the nature of their work or the nature of the organization. As we'll see a little bit later on, one of the questions that you're likely to get in an interview stems around this idea of, well, first of all, why do you want this job? But also, why do you want to work here? Or even, what do you know about us, right? So there's sort of three interconnected questions that you might expect in an interview. What do you know about us? And what you shouldn't say is, well, I know you posted a job that I applied to, or I know that your headquarters is in Toronto, anything that's sort of not really that interesting. What you really want to be able to say is, I've been reading about some of your posts for the recent project that you've been working on, or I saw recently an article about this, or whatever it is. So all of these social media platforms provide a little bit of that puzzle that you can then return and as part of your interviewing and say, look, I've read this, I've seen this, I found that interesting. And that helps you be more engaging as people are sort of interviewing you and trying to figure out if you're a good fit for the organization. So, Deloitte, I've been focusing on some of these slides. These are just recent posts, from LinkedIn, on LinkedIn from Deloitte. You can see who's posted, you can see, who responds to it. You can get a sense of what they are prioritizing in the work that they're doing. And so if someone says, well, why do you want to work here? You can reference some of these things. You can say, I was noticing recently the priority that your organization puts towards this. And that's important to me. I want that to be part of the work that I do, or I want to be able to contribute to that work. So very sort of deep dive into the organization, but very easy to do, but it'd take you a good 45 minutes to sort of crawl through those and get some of the information out. but very handy, I think, at the end of the day. And sometimes the information that they're sharing is about how to interview effectively, right? So if you're applying for McKinsey and they're talking about their case interviewing and things like that, it's great information to have. And they're putting it out there so that you know it and can see it ahead of time. They're not trying to hide it from you. So do take some time to really jump in and understand it. And then as you sort of think about what you've come up with, these are or what we've been reading. These are some of the questions that you can ask yourself, or the things to focus on, right? The stories that they tell, because interviewing is about telling stories. So the more you hear other people's stories, the easier it is to tell yours. The language that they use. We've been talking about this a lot in terms of resumes and cover letters and making sure your language reflects their language, right? So this is a great way of finding some of that language. Listen to where their energy lies. Where do they get energized when they're talking, right? Because that may be something that you share in common in terms of being energized by that experience. Think about what you still don't know, having read all the job description, read their website, read all the things in between, because those are going to be some of the questions that you might ask in an interview. Because again, they are going to ask you, do you have any questions for us? And your questions obviously shouldn't be just about the organization as a whole. They should be about the specific role that you have, but they can intersect with some of the things that you've been reading about or haven't seen as you've been reading about this organization. So a great way to do some of that research to get up to speed. Look for likely interview questions. And what I mean by this is sometimes the questions that you might be asked in an interview are already posted out there based on other people's experiences. And so a platform like Glassdoor, you can sign on for that. In order to sort of gain access to some of their information, you have to give them a little bit of something. You have to tell them your salary or your experience or something that you did as an internship. So if you're not comfortable doing that, that's fine. You just won't get access to a lot of the information. I'll show you another tool that you can use that doesn't require you to share anything in just a second. But on Glassdoor, what you can do is you can look up an organization, an employer, and then look at the reviews, the salaries. You can see some of the jobs, the benefits, but also interviews, right? So these interviews provide people's experiences for different types of roles where they were asked questions, and they'll talk about how long the process was, what it looked like, and then some of the questions that they got. So if you're a brand strategy, apply for a brand strategy role, what are your favorite brands on Twitter is a question that this person was asked, and it makes sense in terms of what that looks like. For a researcher interview on the right-hand side, what's a project you're most proud of, or how do you handle feedback you don't agree with? It doesn't mean that you're going to get asked these questions, but it does mean that there's an increased probability that you might, right? And so being just aware of those types of questions is helpful as you think about what do I need to prepare for these interviews. Again, I wouldn't look at someone's questions on Glassdoor and say, well, these are the only questions I'm going to prepare for, because it doesn't quite work that way. Although in some firms they do ask very, very specific questions for each candidate. And so you might find that too as part of your research. So that's Glassdoor. The links to all these resources I'm putting back in the chat for you, just for your information, but you can find the link to Glassdoor and the link to the other platforms I'm talking about in the links that I'm sharing right now. The other platform that you can do this on is actually Handshake, right? So you all have free access to Handshake. If you go to the employer tab at the top, you can then search for different employers, and what you'll find there are the same sorts of information. You'll see an overview of the employer, you'll see reviews by students and postdocs who've engaged with that employer, and then you may even see interview answers, sorry, not the answers, that would be helpful, but the questions that they are framing that some people have experienced as part of their interview. Now, Handshake is it's basically a global platform now, but there's over 500 institutions in the US plus that have Handshake. And so these interviews are drawn not just from the Penn population, but from all the populations that use Handshake. That population, in terms of its usage on Handshake, does skew towards the undergraduates, but there are certainly, as I've looked through this platform, interview pointers and reviews from graduate students and postdocs. So it's a smaller pool, but it's just another resource that you have free access to, where you might be able to gain some insight. And in this case, the question that's posed to the students is, what is one question that you're asked? So you can sort of get a sampling of those questions there. So that's going to maximize your likelihood that you are going to be ready for questions that are typical questions. It won't necessarily maximize your likelihood of answering questions that are unique to your job or your department, or that are asked by the hiring manager in very sort of personalized ways. But a really great thing to do to sort of maximize your readiness. If you're going into Consulted, another platform that we have is Management Consulted, something that you can sign up for on our website for free, we pay for it so that you gain access to it for free. So if you are interested in Consulted and want to practice your case interview type experiences, then Management Consulted is going to be there. So the type of case that you get obviously is going to be different in every interview, but the way that you answer it is going to sort of be very similar. So knowing that you're going to get that question, you can sort of look at examples of questions and then ways to answer some of those questions as you are using this platform. So feel free to set up an account for that if consulting is a direction that you're interested in. So I did mention that networking is going to be critical, and let me just sort of frame up, why it's helpful at this point in time, even though there's sort of a limited amount of time to do that. For people who have, already been part of some of our sessions, we've talked about the alumni tool on LinkedIn. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. If you search for the University of Pennsylvania on LinkedIn, you'll be taken to the school page. If you click on alumni as one of the options, then you'll see the 190,000 alums that are listed here, which is great. This is a searchable or interactive database, I should say, that's sort of broken down by 6 bits of information. I've shared 4 of those bits of information here: where they live, where they work, what they do, and what they studied. And so if you have an interview coming up with an organization, you can come over to this alumni tool and throw in the name of the organization and see if there are any Penn alumni working there, with the idea that you may know these people, you may have connections with these people may be willing to share their experiences going through the interview. So you might reach out and say, hey, I found you on LinkedIn. I see that you are an X at this organization. I have an interview coming up on Friday. And I was wondering if you would feel comfortable sharing some of your experiences going through the interview. So you should always be very overt, right? You should never sort of dissemble or hide the fact that you have an interview, because they may not be able to help you. They may be part of a hiring committee. They may be in a totally different division. They may have been told that they can't share some of their interview experiences with other people, whatever the issue is. So if you just be upfront, I have this interview on Friday, I'm wondering if you'd feel comfortable sharing some of your experiences so that I can best prepare myself for that interview. And sometimes I think people are very open to doing that. So if I was looking for someone who was working at Genentech, there are 99 Penn alumni there. I can see what they studied, so I might find someone in my program. Obviously, that's going to be more of an overlap there. It doesn't have to be that person. I can see many of the people are in research roles, which would make sense. And here, if I scroll down when I'm on the LinkedIn screen, then I get to see who those people are: a senior scientist, a postdoc, another senior scientist, and a director, right? And so you can look through this and say, well, who might be best positioned to answer some of the questions that I have about this upcoming interview? Someone who's most recent in their role is probably the best contact to have. So if they've been a director there and they've been working there for 10 years, they won't be able to share their experiences as a candidate. They'll be able to share thoughts as a hiring manager, and that's a slightly different reflection. So I would always aim for, especially in a short time frame, someone who shares something in common with you, like a school or a degree, who's in an organization where you can say, would you be willing to share some of your experiences? So you can look at when they graduated, and that might give you a sense of how recently they are, but also you can look at their profile and see when they started. So his comment here started in January 2020 to give you a sense of, she's still a fairly recent hire there. And you can see, from the education background, what that looks like. Now, Carmen was a second degree connection. So, from my networks, we share an institution in common, and we share a person in common, or a couple of people in common. So I know a couple of people who are first degree connections with Carmen. So I could always reach out to those people first and ask them if they'd be willing to connect me to Carmen, or willing to help me start a conversation. That might ease the process and speed it up, because remember, you are on a short time frame here before the interview actually kicks in. There's also, a good best practice is to make sure that you don't actually have first degree connections there as well. So you can filter that alumni tool by second degree connections, first degree connections, and everyone else. So Danielle here recently started in April 2021, and is a first degree connection. So I would feel much more confident that if I reached out to Danielle, she would be more likely to be able to share insights about the interviewing process, even if it's for a different role, because she may be in a very different role, because we have connections in common. This is why it's a good reason to have a good network, so that you can leverage them as you need them for these types of situations. So your first degree connection is always going to be a great tool to help you gain insight into that. Prepare for the expected. Obviously, people say prepare for the unexpected, but if you know something's coming, you should definitely prepare for it. So as we think about the interview scenario, there are sort of three categories of broad categories of questions that I think pop up time and time again. There's the who are you questions, where people want to know about you and your skills and your characteristics. There are the why questions. Why are you applying? Why are your skills relevant, right? So it's a slightly different variation of that. And then there are sort of the behavioral-based questions. Give me an example of a time where you use this skill or use this or gain this experience or whatever that looks like. In terms of general interviews, these first two categories often generate the same set of 5 or 6 questions that you're likely to get in every interview that you go to, regardless of what job or what organization, right? So tell me about yourself is usually the first question that everyone always asks. So you should be expecting that one. Sometimes it's tell me about yourself and why do you want this position, right? Sort of 2-in-1 question there. What do you know about us? We talked about that slightly before. Very important question, just to demonstrate that you actually do know who this organization is and that you care about the nature of the work there. Why do you want this job? Actually, I wrote here, what do you want this job? It should be, why do you want this job? It's sort of a fundamental question, right? It's basically the only question that you need to ask in a job interview to a certain extent. So that's one you should be prepared for. What do you bring to this role? This is a cluster of questions that relate to your skills, your experiences, the value that you add. So it's not just a single question. It might be a greatest strength question. It might be where do you see your skills fitting in here type question. But it's an opportunity for you to say, well, let me tell you how my experiences add value to this organization. So you're hoping for a question in this cluster because it gives you an opportunity to talk about the things that you do well and that you're excited to do. And then finally, do you have any questions for us? The answer to that question is always yes. If at any point you hear yourself saying no, correct it immediately, say yes, because I've certainly been in interviews for our organization here where people have said no, I have everything I need. And that was really the end of their sort of candidacy there because the committee as a whole felt like they just were not interested in it. And maybe they weren't interested in it, and that's fine. But I think if you are interested in it, you always need to have questions. So we're going to touch on different aspects of this throughout the rest of the presentation. So I'm not really going to go into too much more detail in this, except for a couple of things, right? So the tell me about yourself question, you really want to be very confident about that. If you're sort of, deer in the headlights, I don't know who I am. That's not a great start to an interview because this is the first question. You don't necessarily need to tell them things that they already know. So if you're applied to a doctoral level position and you say, well, I'm a 4th-year postdoc, or I'm a 5th-year postdoc, or whatever it is, 5-year postdoc, or PhD, whatever it is that you are, they know that already. And that's not really defining the value that you bring. That's defining where you are in the timeline. So for the tell me about yourself question, I often recommend a more thematic sort of way of describing yourself. I've always seen myself as someone who enjoys, communicating science, right? And then you can sort of use that theme to walk through your chronology, your experience, your resume, and point out where that sort of experience or where your interest in doing that comes to life, right? So thematic just makes it slightly more engaging as opposed to you saying, well, I'm a postdoc or I'm a 5th-year PhD. The other aspect about the tell me about yourself question is that it should, at the end of that question, be forward-looking, right? You don't want to get to the end of your sort of answer and go, well, that's me then, and then stop, because it's sort of, it doesn't take you anywhere. It's just you're sort of awkwardly sitting there as people contemplate you and your corporeal self as part of that interview. My recommendation is then to pivot into, and that's why I'm so excited about this opportunity because, right? So if in your tell me about yourself, you've summarized the relevant skills and experiences that you have and the sort of the way that you approach the work and the way that your own characteristics doing work, and then you can sort of flip that over and say, and that's why I'm interested in this role because I see that you're looking for someone who does this, or who likes this, who wants this. Then you've made a very nice sort of a match between your skills and your experiences and the job itself. And it's also just, it reminds them that you are actually interested in the role that you're applying for. We talked about what do you know about us? In terms of why do you want this job, this is a 2-part question that's really sort of that you can think about, or at least a 2-part answer. The first part of the answer should always be what you bring to the role. And the second part is what you gain from the role. So oftentimes when we do mock interviews and you say, well, why do you want this position? People say, well, I'm really looking for an opportunity to grow professionally. I'm looking for a more senior position. I'm looking for an opportunity to get my hands on more projects. All of those things are about you, and they're all important things about you, but none of those things by themselves add value to the organization and certainly don't answer the questions that the interviewer has about, can you do the job? So yes, cover those questions, but cover those after you've addressed what it is that you bring in terms of your skills. So if someone says, well, why do you want this position? You might say, well, given my understanding of the role, from the job description, from me talking with people, what I think you're looking for is someone who can do X, Y, and Z, which is great because I have X, and here's an example. I have Y, and here's an example, and I'm really excited about doing Z, right? So, and then you can shift into, and I'm also really excited about a very focused, socially justice focused organization because I really want to utilize my skills to grow professionally in this field. So you can say build on that as part of the second part of your answer. Now, I have covered this in slightly more detail in a couple of other videos. Again, the links to these are in the chat that I posted, but these just sort of go into detail about a few more, so how to ask good questions, but also how to answer the tell me about yourself questions. So do take a look at those if you want more information on those. I mentioned earlier that interviewing is really a storytelling experience, right? The resume doesn't create a story. The cover letter gets closer to telling a story. In the interview, it's really all about stories. And this is where these behavioral-based questions come into play, because when someone says, give me an example of a time when you've done X, you can't just say, yes, I've done X, right? You have to sort of integrate it into a narrative that says, well, here's the situation, here was what we faced, here's how I approached it, here's what I learned from it. And that is actually a story. Now, good stories are concise and to the point and prioritize information or excite people who are reading it because it resonates with them. Stories that meander and don't have a beginning or an end and don't really end and keep going forever and ever and ever, those aren't great stories. And so that's what we're trying to avoid as we think about preparing for interview scenarios. Now, these behavioral-based questions occur everywhere. So these are just 3 examples of industries: consulting, biotech and pharma, let's say, or the tech industry, and even being on the faculty job path, behavioral-based interviewing questions pop up all the time. So it's really great to sort of get well-versed in how to answer these questions. These are examples of behavioral-based questions that, they're all framed they're all framed in terms of, give me an example of a time when you've done something, or describe a situation, or what's an example of. These are, across the board, these are broad behavioral categories, organizing, collaborating, problem solving, things that are likely to be useful in any role that you might be applying for. You can see a link here to, we have about 12 pages of these behavioral-based questions, and there's 12 pages of them simply because you can ask about the same behavior multiple ways in sort of with different emphasis, right? So if we think about critical thinking or decision-making or leadership, these are all examples along the similar theme of getting at those questions. Again, your goal here is not to go through each one of these and try to create an answer and write it down and have a script for it, because that will make your head explode. So the thing to do is to realize that when you come up with good examples, you can apply different examples. You can apply the same example to answer different behavioral-based questions. You just have to tweak that example a little bit to highlight some of the different skills or different behaviors that you've used as part of that experience. So that the secret to answering any behavioral-based question is for you, even before you get into an interview, to say, what are the stories that I'm most excited to tell about my experience that I think would be relevant? And if you can prepare those stories, then you'll find that it's much easier to adapt your narrative as you're going through. So that means that, in terms of the interview scenario, yes, they are looking for experiences and skills and knowledge that are specific to the role. You have skills, experiences, and knowledge, some which are specific, some which are transferable, some which are other things. If you look for that overlap between these 2 things, and in the middle between these 2 areas are the stories that you want to highlight about your experience. And within those stories, there are ones that are exciting to you because they really energize you, and there are ones that are less exciting. And so obviously prioritizing the ones that are exciting for you is going to bring a lot of energy as you tell those stories in an interview scenario. So those stories then form the basis of answering any of these behavioral-based questions. Now, we talked about networking, how important it is. And let me sort of illustrate in sort of very direct ways how sort of some of the questions that you can ask, translate to an interview scenario. So you are meeting with a contact who works at an organization that you're interested in, and you ask them, what are some of the challenges that you face in your roles? What are the skills that you use to overcome those situations? And then you listen to their story. You take a few notes and you just listen to the way that they frame that story. And then in an interview, someone says to you, well, give me an example about a challenge that you faced in a previous role or current role and how you overcame it. Now, your story obviously will be different from the story that you heard from the alarm or from your connection, but the way that they frame their story, the pressures that were upon them in terms of solving the problem or overcoming the challenge, there may be similarities between the stories that you can tell. And so again, if you can use some of their language, some of the nature of the challenges that they face, and integrate it into your own story, then that story becomes a very meaningful and impactful story as part of your interview. So the questions that you ask, the connections can translate into very direct ways, into ways to help you be better positioned for these interviews. Obviously, you can't tell their stories, but you can tell your stories better or more relevantly, as you are applying for these types of positions. So the way then to structure these stories is using the STAR format. We've touched on this again yesterday as we were talking about cover letters. This is not magical in any means. It's just a way of structuring your narrative. Situation, task, action, result. That way you know where the story begins and you know where the story ends, and you can keep it concise. And people often ask, well, how long should the stories be? A 2-minute story is a great story. Sometimes if the story is so relevant to the role, you may go longer than that. It doesn't have to be 2 minutes. I mean, it's very nuanced. It sometimes depends on the length of the interview. But usually in 2 minutes, you can tell a fairly decent story, so long as you sort of keep your narrative structured in this way. Now, I don't like the word task because it feels like something you have to do instead of something that you want to do. I prefer thinking about this as a challenge, right? The challenge that you have to overcome, because the challenge adds in a little bit of drama and tension. The problem is it turns the STAR format, which sounds very lofty, to the SCAR format, which sounds very scary. So I appreciate that the word task may be a better word in the short term. What the STAR format does is it sort of creates a narrative story arc, right? So the situation is important because without that, people have no idea what's going on, right? So it's like, starting watching a film in the middle and all the character development has already happened. And you're like, who are these people and what's going on? So when people do mock interviews with me and I ask them about, give me an example of, and they say, as their answer, well, we were working on a project and X, right? Immediately what that does to me is like, well, what project and who's we, right? So it creates confusion. What you don't want to do is create any confusion. You want to lay out the groundwork very quickly at the beginning. I'll show you some examples of the types of questions that you can ask there. But the idea of the story is that you should work towards the drama and the tension to really engage people. And that is the challenge, right? So rather than saying, I did this, you would say, when I did this, one of the most challenging aspects, or even one of the most exciting aspects. So, you can use different language, but the idea is that you want to frame up a thing that needs to be overcome using a skill, right? The skill that they ask you about. Give me an example of a time where you collaborated, where you led, where you solved a problem, where you communicated effectively. Whatever the skill is that they're mentioning, the challenge should be something that you've overcome using that skill in an ideal world. So you frame up the drama, and then you talk about the way that you overcame that, and then you sort of release the tension by talking about that, and then you ended up by saying, and it was great because it ended up with this. And the ending is just as important as the beginning, because sometimes if a story ends halfway, just like a film that you're watching, you're like, huh? What's going on? So making sure that you tie all the strings up, whatever the expression is. So here's sort of just a breakdown then of the different categories that I just talked about. So situation, who, when, what was the goal, right? Frame up the thing so that even if the project that you were doing is unrelated to the role that you're applying to, you just want to use the example, everyone knows what you're talking about. The challenge, why was it challenging? Why did the problem exist? Why did this bring you energy to try to solve this? Maybe it didn't bring you energy, maybe it was thrust upon you, and yet you still managed to overcome that. The action that you take. Sometimes when people talk about actions, they often say, well, we did this and we did that, which is fine because oftentimes you're going to be doing this not as an individual, but as part of a collaboration. Just make sure that you don't only talk about we, because then you dilute your impact, right? So you can certainly say, our response to this was part of a 4-person collaborative team. My role in particular was to do this. And I think that contributed to the outcome because of this, right? So you can insert yourself into the narrative, even though it was a collaborative effort, because at the end of the day, they're interviewing you and not your team. And then the result is just a helpful way of wrapping it up, right? This worked out really well because we got it published on time, because we finished the project, because we found something exciting. Whatever the outcome is, it doesn't have to be the big world outcome. It can be an outcome that was associated with whatever the actual challenge was. So this is just an example of how you might frame up some of those stories. These are all things that you can do ahead of time, thinking about the behaviors that you might be asked about, you can then create stories that might match some of those behaviors. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. The two things that I always like to add on to this are sort of the emotional resonance of the experience and also the relevance of the experience to the role. So if you can go through your example and then tell them about the outcome and then sort of take a mental step back and say, as I think about that, I really appreciate the fact that I took this risk, or I use this approach, or I really valued the collaboration that I gained from that experience, and I've actually used it more since then and lent into that collaboration. What it does is it helps the interviewer get a sense of you and your inner thinking, right? You're basically just expressing the things that are going on in your head and saying, I really enjoyed this. I really found this particularly valuable, and that's helpful. And then the relevance is tying it back into the role, right? So you've given this example, you've given an outcome, and then you might say, and I know from the job description that you're really looking for someone who's able to grapple with those types of situations. And so hopefully you can see that this experience, I think matches some of those things. And I'm very excited about using similar approaches in this new role. So especially if it's a greatest strength question, what's your greatest strength? You say, here's my strength, here's an example, and then you definitely want to tie that back in, because ideally your greatest strength is something that is really super valuable to the role that you're applying to. So those are sort of two additional things that you can talk about. Again, these are just sort of framing it up in terms of how those extra components to the STAR story can add value to the interview that you're going through. So again, stories aren't always the easiest to sort of frame up. I'm telling a story, but the idea is what makes a story engaging is a little bit of drama, and what makes a story meaningful is when it's structured enough that it begins and ends in very meaningful ways. If it keeps on going forever and ever and ever, it doesn't matter what you said. No one's going to remember it, because you're lost in the forest of the story itself. In terms of anticipating the questions or the behaviors, there's a couple of things that you can do to sort of make sure that you are aware of that. Again, you're networking with people, asking them what skills are most valuable, or what competencies, professional identities are most valuable in the role. But even looking at the job description, you can sort of guess at some of the questions that they might be asking, right? So this is a project manager at Twitter. If we look at some of the descriptions here, right? So develop, manage, and track team budgets. We can then say, well, what are the skills that they're looking for? The skills here are in the red box: quantitative skills, attention to detail, strategic thinking. And then we can sort of try to imagine, well, what questions would people ask to know if I had those? Give me an example of a time when you managed a budget. Obviously, would be a good sort of very direct question. When have you done more with less, right? Because you may not have managed a budget, but you may have had to have some connection with financial changes that affected the work that you're doing. So this is going to give you an idea then of some of the questions that might come up, depending on what the priority is for that organization. Manage the operational cadence of the team and include staff in team meetings. So again, this is more about team culture and building that. So the skills might be communication, might be developing this culture. The questions might be, well, have you done that? What's your approach to advocating for people on your team in terms of collaborations and things like that? So that's another way of framing up some of those skills in the job description into questions that you might then get. Ensuring the right stakeholders are involved in the right way and at the right time based on this decision model. Again, you want to look up what that decision-making model is so that you are aware of that. What they need from someone are strategic thinking, good decision-making skills, good judgment. How would you get to those types of scenarios in terms of an interview? Well, these are some of the questions that might pop up. And so as you're then preparing some of your interview answers, these are some of the stories that you might be able to prepare some of the stories that relate to some of the things that you think they may ask you. So you don't have to go in totally blind and not know what questions are going to come your way. You can think about those from the job description and then try to preempt some of those questions with stories that you've made. Here's one more. So proven ability. So again, in the requirements of the job description, they want demonstrated and proven, right? These are the flags that we talked about in the resume to make sure that you've touched on, that you've touched on, as part of your application materials. In an interview, they just want you to do more of that. They want you to go into more detail about what this has looked like. So proven ability to work in this environment. The question I would ask if it was my job is, tell me how you've worked in a fast-paced environment. And you can't just say, well, I have. You have to sort of illustrate what that looks like in the way that's unique to you. And again, so as we go through the job description, you'll see that each of these bullet points could lead to multiple questions. And that's slightly challenging because obviously there's not going to be time to ask you 30 questions, but I think it's helpful just to sort of frame up in your own mind, well, what are examples that might be able to touch on a couple of these questions at once? As I said, when you tell a story, it's not about a single skill, right? They may be asking you about communication, but your answer may include leadership. It may include collaboration, as well as the communication. So one story can answer several different types of questions that are out there. Now, in terms of this one here, right, so the questions I might ask about this one might be, in terms of problem solving, what's a problem that you can't solve or you didn't solve, right? So it's a slightly different problem, slightly different question to tell me about a problem that you solved, which is all upbeat and positive. This one is a slightly more negative sort of focused question, right? So this is introduces us to this idea that they may be positive leaning questions and negative leaning questions. And you really need to sort of be prepared to a little bit for both of those so that you're not surprised by the negative ones. So here's sort of examples of taking a positive and flipping it around to a negative. Give me an example of a time where you're part of a successful team. Give me an example of a time where the team went horribly wrong. Tell me when you solved a problem. Tell me when you couldn't. What's your success? When have you failed? Strength, weakness, and so on, right? So it's important to think about the negatives because you certainly don't want to leave a negative story hanging out there for someone to sort of remember. It's okay to be authentic and it's okay to be honest about situations that didn't work, but there's a strategy to make sure that you're bringing that back to the positive. And so this is my general strategy for answering a negative leaning question. What's an example? Give an example of a time where you're part of a team and it didn't work out well. What I would do is I would look for an example that's as far back in your sort of current role as possible, right? So if you're a postdoc, you might say, well, at the beginning of my postdoc, or as a doctoral student, you might say, at the beginning of my program, I joined a student club where we were part of a team of 5 different people who had all these things, right? So this is your star story for a negative story. The challenge that we faced with our team is that we all had different priorities and we had no idea how Penn worked. And so we were trying to organize an event and honestly, it didn't work, right? We did not get an event. It failed to pieces. I found that upsetting that we weren't able to achieve that. So that's your outcome, your negative outcome. Certainly you don't want to just leave it there. So the next step is to say, well, this is what I learned from that, right? Having thought about that experience, I really realized that one of the things that we didn't do as that group was get to know each other and leverage the resources that were available. So that's something that I've been working on throughout my time at Penn, is making sure that I am connecting with those resources. That's what you learned, and what you're going to do with it is this last story now where you say, and so I've actually used that knowledge that I gained from doing this in a new project that I'm working on where we are organizing another event. And we took a very different approach in this one. And so my role as part of this project was to coordinate the team efforts together so we were on the same page. It was still challenging because of this, but it worked out well because of this, right? So the star story at the end is a positive one because it takes into account what you learned from the negative one. You don't have to do this every time, but it's a great way of making sure that you're demonstrating a true life issue that happened, because everyone has issues that happen, a way of reflecting on those, and then a way of demonstrating how you've used that knowledge to be successful moving forward. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of answering those negative leaning questions. Practice and prep your space. So I'll run through this quickly. It's really great to practice your answers, your stories out loud, not because you're trying to remember a script, but because you will remember more of how you want to say it when you listen to yourself saying it. So you can record it, but you can say it out loud, just to make sure that you have that auditory memory of the sort of the energy that you're giving it. Because it's very stressful in an interview sometimes, and your brain's not working at its full capacity. But if it remembers hearing you say it, or remembers you saying it and then hearing you saying it, you're going to find it flows much more effectively as you're giving answers to those questions. You can also use our big interview platform, right? So this allows you to record your own interview answers to pre-recorded questions across all of these different industries. By having these mock interviews, you can then listen to yourself answer these questions in your own time. That's helpful too. You can reflect on better ways of answering the question, but you can also hear yourself say it moving forward. So a really great way of practicing. The link to a big interview is in the resources that I've shared in the chat. I'll do it one more time in case people cannot see it. Right there for you. So make sure you do take advantage of a big interview. It is a platform about how to prepare for interviews. They also have a video curriculum on how to interview. So obviously there's great resources built into that platform as well. I did a very quick making the most of big interview video, so I won't go into too much detail on big interview, but you can see more information about that in that video. We also do mock interviews here at Career Services. Mock interviews are an hour-long appointment where we have that availability. You can also do an interview prep appointment, both for the PhD students and postdocs that at least my team serves. So take advantage of both of those if you have an interview coming up. If you really have an upcoming interview and you can't find any availability, then do reach out. You can reach out to me by email and just let us know. And if we do have availability, we'll try to make sure that if you have an actual interview coming up and you've had no experience prepping for it, that we can give you some insight into that. Most interviews are sort of, at least first round, are going to be virtual. Even, we're sort of, I don't know what we're doing with the pandemic, but we're in a different phase of the pandemic. Some are going to be in person. For your virtual space, obviously making sure that you have set it up appropriately. You can have your style stories written out in note form on a piece of paper, and you can stick them right behind that monitor so that when people ask you questions and you can't remember which example that you want to use, you can look into the distance. You can go, oh, that's a really great question. Let me think about that. And then scan your wall for a good example. Don't put a script up there. Don't make it obvious. Don't even do this if you don't want to do this. But I always like to have resources available, assets available to me in case I have a total, complete brain void and can't think of anything to say. So that's an example of that. If you are on a platform, this is all stuff that is very familiar in our sort of virtual space. But if your internet goes out, or if their internet goes out, you may want to just double check with them what the plan B is, right? You could share a phone number. If we are unable to connect, here's a phone number that you can reach me at, or can you share a phone number that I can reach you at in case we run into problems with connectivity? I don't anticipate anything. I just like to be prepared. So just make sure that you've thought about that as well. Setting the stage in this day and age, a virtual interviewing, what was the handshake, the first impression that a handshake used to give is now your lighting. So get your lighting right, nice lighting hitting your face, no backlighting behind you. If you have a swivel chair like I do, throw it out the window, because in an interview, when you get nervous, you will do this. It's sort of unavoidable to do it. So you just find a fixed chair, that will be better. And then frame yourself up in there you go, throw it out. Frame yourself up in the screen so that you are the right distance away, that it feels like you're in the same room. Obviously, it's just easy things to do. What they say, I think, in terms of best practices, is that your eyes want to be aligned along that top horizontal line. So you sort of 2/3 of the way up is where your eyes should be, and that sort of makes you feel that you're not too close, not too far away, but just right. There you go, just like that. When I see a picture like this and I think about interviewing, 3 things pop to mind. One is the camera setting. So if you have a laptop on the table and it's pointing up, I can see your head and I can see the ceiling, which is very bizarre for me. I'm 6'2". I'm usually at people's head height. When I'm interviewing and I'm having to look up at you, it's sort of a weird scenario. So bring your camera up to eye level. You'll look much better. The lighting will work much better. If you have food and drink around, you're going to spill it somehow during an interview. So have water certainly, but nothing else. And then your phone, it's sort of unfortunately a tick that we all have now, that your phone beeps and you're like, what's that? And you don't even mean to look at it, but it sort of beeps. And people can hear when your phone bings or beeps, and if you look at it, it's really the wrong impression, right? You're interviewing with them, you're telling them, and then you're like, oh, what's going on with the news? So don't throw your phone out the window, just throw it in a different room and turn it off, is my example to that. What's on your background? Just important to think about some of those things. Certainly I've had one-on-one appointments with people with different background things and pictures of their family and not. There's no right answer to this. It really depends on you and what's important to you and the nature of the job. But think about how that might be perceived. There's a great Twitter account that sort of provides critiques on people's books in the bookcases behind them when they're on TV interviews. You can get a sense of how people spend too much time focusing on that. During the interview itself, try to keep obviously eye contact if it's a virtual one with the camera. Turn everything else off. Don't worry if the unexpected happens. My favorite YouTube video here, which I'll leave here for you, is the BBC reporter whose children come in, and then the wife comes in to try to wrestle the children out, and he stays very, very calm and very, very focused, and he gets through it. And so sometimes those things happen, but it's okay. If you get very nervous in interviews, try to get to your storytelling as soon as possible, because through your storytelling, you'll find that if you're talking about energizing topics, you will feel more energized. A story is safe territory because you've already lived that experience. You're not having to come up with new versions of it. So if you can get to your stories, you'll find you'll relax much more into the interview as you're doing that. When I ask people questions in mocks, oftentimes the first answer is, well, I think, because they are thinking. What that does is it really softens the answer a little bit. So try to pause first before answering so you can eliminate some of that. These are just examples of questions, immediate responses that I might give, not to every question, to give yourself a little bit of time to think so that when you do start talking, that's going to be okay. Well, I realize we're running out of time here. Defining the skill is actually a really important way of giving yourself time to think. So if someone says, give me an example of your creativity, creativity is an ambiguous concept. It's like, well, what does it actually mean? And so sometimes people get stuck in this not knowing how to answer it or not knowing really what the interviewer wants, and the stories go all over the place. So here's my strategy for dealing with that. So if someone does ask you about your creativity and you just say, well, I'm creative when I do X, you don't know if that creativity and your height or your interviewer's creativity are the same thing. And if they're not the same thing, then what that means is that your example and their example may not overlap, because they're like, well, that's great, but that's not how I see creativity. I define it very differently. My suggestion then is to define the term. To me, creativity means X, Y, and Z, and then you can give an example. And what that does is it provides a shared context to what that term is, so that the interviewer can appreciate how you define it and then better understand why your example is relevant to that. And if you share that context, then because you share that definition, your ideas of whatever the term is, creativity or leadership, will overlap much more effectively. It also gives you time to think, right? If you say, well, to me, creativity means X, Y, and Z, then you're coming up with a definition which gives your brain time to come up with an actual example to support that thing. So that's a great strategy to give yourself a little bit more time to focus on. And then as we wrap up, a thank you note is going to be important, thank you email. So as soon as you're done with the interview, you don't want to write an immediate thank you email because you've already just thanked them and then you've logged off, or you've left the building, within 24 hours, but give it an hour or two before you get back to them. Send a very brief thank you note that says, thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I really appreciate it. I look forward to continuing through the process. If you have to send a thank you email to different people, then try to reflect on what each of these people said to you. I really appreciated when you mentioned this, or I really enjoyed the question that you asked about that, right? So that way they know that it's not just a generic email. So within 24 hours, but not like 5 minutes after the interview, because that feels a little bit rushed. Let's rush through some of the resources. Again, these are all in the links that I shared in the chat. On the website, we have our Learn How to Interview page, which brings together some of our interview resources into a one page. You can play around with that. We talked about Big Interview and their video curriculum. They have a mastery track and a fast track, so 50 videos on different types of interviewing that you can go through. They have a star story builder tool, so you can begin to practice that as part of your own preparation for interviews. We talked about the industry mocks that you can do, sort of different questions based on these different industries. Aurora, we've talked about that throughout the week. Another great platform. They have a preparing for interview session or video here that's going to be helpful for professional careers of different types. So do take a look at that. We also have an interviewing guide for graduate students and postdocs, very much like our informational interviewing guide, short and to the point. You might find this one helpful just to give you some pointers for interviewing. Management consultant, I mentioned already, if you're interested in consulting. And then don't forget LinkedIn Learning, because you have access to that. Plenty of videos on interview strategies there that you can take a look at in your own time.